Hello students. Today we talk about the 1950s and the Eisenhower presidency and administration. Eisenhower makes my top 10 list of the best presidents. He maybe even makes my top 5, although there's some competition for that fourth and fifth spot. And he was a great president. He was popular as a retired war hero. He was thought to be, anyway, apolitical. He could have run as either a Democrat or a Republican, apparently, but he went with the Republicans. As the Allied commander, he had organized vast numbers of men, and so as president, he's delegating a lot of power. This is a familiar job for him, and he did excel at it. What was his style? Now, this is such an interesting question, because Eisenhower is often thought, one of his political opponents, Taft, thought he was sort of a do-nothing president, that he liked to play golf, he should have just been a golf pro. But see, this was one of Eisenhower's real intelligent ways crafty ways of running the government. He liked to appear that he wasn't doing much. He would make it appear that he had a light schedule, that he wasn't doing much, and then he could delegate to his top aides and let them kind of hash it out, fight it out, and he would treat them as if they were prima donnas and he doesn't know what to do or so forth. But he ended up, of course, making the decisions. And the benefit of this was it protected him politically. It also kept the Soviets and the Chinese guessing what was he up to. He was masterful at this. When he was in conference, when he was meeting with foreign dignitaries, with top foreign leaders, he was smart enough to pretend to misunderstand his translator, so he could bend it to give him more negotiating room. He was also someone who used military gobbledygook, and so people thought, oh, he's not very good with language, you know, he's not using. Well, he was doing this intentionally because, again, he wanted to obscure what he was saying, keep them guessing. So he was, internationally, he did as well as one could expect. He came to the end of the Korean War, which was not going, I mean, it was one of these wars that was not going to end well no matter what you did, and so he kept it under control. Truman had also, I think, handled that wisely. He also, I mean, it's hard to think of, under Eisenhower, of his having something like the Bay of Pigs, that 1961 fiasco under Kennedy that's going to come in the early 60s. He handled things well internationally. He was a two-term president. He was elected in 1952 and re-elected in 1956. So he was in office from 1953, because he was elected in 1952, 1953, of course, to 1961. He could have, so he's going back to this idea of the two-term president. He was a fiscal conservative. He wanted to end the wage and price controls. Truman, of course, had been more liberal politically and domestically. He balanced the budget. So this was great in terms of what to do in the post-war economy, in the post-war financial situation. So he balanced the budget. He provided for the military. He's also known for at the end of his term, warning the nation of the military-industrial complex. So the way that monies could be unwisely spent or budgets could get out of control with military often wasting money. So we saw that become something that future administrations were more aware of and tried to. We've seen this in the current administration, where although a lot of money is being spent on the military, they're trying to cut out waste and over expenditure. So that's briefly. I would like to go great writers that talk about Eisenhower are Stephen Ambrose. I have some of his books right here. Wonderful biography series under Stephen Ambrose. Also, something that we want to talk about in the 1950s is just what was American culture and society like in the 1950s. Was it, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, at least. We can talk about the affluence of America, the rising prosperity, which is certainly a fact. And we can also talk about, was it an age of anxiety, with nuclear war now being a threat, with the atomic bomb having been developed at the end of World War II. So the historians take sometimes different views. They talk about it being, some talk about it being a halcyon age, an age of optimism and hope, and others stress the anxiety part of it. It was a time of prosperity. Americans came into this post-war period with money. They'd saved their money during the war because there had been shortages. And so it was a time of wedding bells and the baby boom and the growth of the consumer economy. There was this upwards trend of the baby boom going up to, this trend continued until 1961. We see during this period the growth of the suburbs. We see a big increase in home ownership. This was also the period that the economy was helped by the GI Bill of Rights, and this made it possible for the returning veterans to own their own homes, buy their own homes. It provided for education benefits for those that it served. It was also the growth of new entertainment in the growth of TVs. There were only a few televisions in American homes in 1946, but we see a real growth in the 1950s, so that by 1960, 90% of American homes had at least one TV. It was a period of rock and roll, new developments in music. Elvis Presley emerged, also developments in jazz, blues. We see women gaining new roles in the post-war period because they had gained jobs when the men were away at war, and so there was a rising consciousness that women could hold jobs and do things that previously they had been unaccustomed or had not been allowed to do. This is the time of Rosie the Riveter. You probably remember that famous poster that where she's holding up and showing her muscles, and she's wearing a kerchief, and she says, "We can do it." So women working in the factories and so forth. So when the men came home, though, a lot of these job opportunities stopped. So we have this period of rising dissatisfaction, or at least as authors such as Betty Friedan writes about. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique that came out in 1963, and she talks about the problem that has no name and the boredom of the American housewife in the suburbs. Sort of a one-sided view, and it would also lend support to this idea of the 1950s and this early 1960s being an age of dissatisfaction and anxiety. On the optimistic side, I think we can say it was a period of real success in civil rights. And what had happened, of course, is that there had been a tremendous black migration during World War II and also afterwards to northern cities where the job opportunities were. And we see them going to cities such as Chicago and Detroit and the other big cities, new job opportunities, rising expectations, and a lot of progress in civil rights. We see culminating, of course, in that landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. That landmark decision, which was the desegregation case. And then subsequently in the next year, 1955, Brown versus Board number 2, in which the desegregation was ordered to take place by this Warren court with, quote, with all deliberate speed. Sort of a strange concept, being deliberate and yet speedy, so intentionally a little vague, but wanting to make progress and move ahead. And in retrospect, despite a lot of tensions and such people as Governor Orville Faubus standing in the schoolhouse door in 1957 and so forth, a lot of resistance, but we do see, ultimately, as we know, desegregation taking place. I just want to make a couple of comments about this Brown versus Board of Education case, because a lot of times students, and you know this, think about these cases being precipitous, sudden, just like changing the landscape. We talked about that with Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. We can see the same thing in this 1954 Brown case, that there were stepping stones that led to it. It didn't just appear suddenly on the landscape. And there had been work being done on it for years in advance. The Sweat v. Painter case of 1950 was the Texas Law School case, in which it was pointed out that the facilities were not equal because the black law school that was set up was just a little area cordoned off in the lunchroom. It didn't work at all. So that was unacceptable. Still abiding by the old separate but equal standard under Plessy v. Ferguson. Another landmark case is Briggs v. Elliott. This is the South Carolina case of 1951. And it started out as a case that's, again, saying, that, yes, we have separate, but it's definitely not equal, because the little black children are having to walk 15 miles back and forth, 7 to 8 miles each way. They have no school bus, whereas the white kids, they've got school buses, more than one. They've got plenty. This happened in Somerton, Tennessee. It started out as that case, but when it was decided by the Supreme Court, we note that it carried forward with a dissent from Julian Waring, who is a minority opinion, but it's going to carry weight when it comes to Brown versus Board of Education. And his minority opinion was essentially that separate is inherently unequal, that it's not possible to make even though they're attempting to make the schools equal, which absolutely was not the case in Somerton, South Carolina, that this separation on the face of it was unequal, inherently unequal by ipso facto, by their being separate. So we see all these legal arguments, and there's more to it, of course, culminating in the 1954 decision. So, and of course, this is based on the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws. So, for next time, we will be looking at what happens in the 1960s, the turbulent 60s. We'll take a look at how the civil rights movement is going to change from being accommodationist or pushing in a civil way to becoming more militant. And we see the rise of the Black Power movement in the early 1960s. And of course, the irony is, just as this great progress is being made, a large segment of the civil rights movement turns militant and violent with Black Power. Thanks so much. Keep reading, keep working. I look forward to your short papers that are coming in. Please do keep logging on to Canvas and doing your extra reading so we can make progress. Have a great day.